Welcome. We are live here with SCI TV. I'm Joshua Gordon, joined today by my co-hosts Ken Pendleton and Roy Baroff. Welcome, gentlemen.
Hi, Josh.
Hi, Josh. Hi, Ken. Nice to be with you today.
So thanks for joining us. Ken, folks know you, but Roy, you're new to our audience. We're hoping you give a little background about who you are and some of the work you've done both in ADR and working with sports teams in particular.
Sure, and thanks for the opportunity. I'm an attorney, a mediator, an arbitrator, trainer in my current practice, and probably the last 10 years of it, I've had some connections with sports teams. If I go back to about 30 years ago is when I was first trained as a mediator, eventually went to law school, and here in North Carolina we have a lot of mediation in our legal system, and so most of my work is as a mediator in litigated cases. On the sports side, I played soccer in high school, and then in college at the University of North Carolina many years ago in the mid-'70s. I will say though, I continue to play. I play for an over 50s team, and so it's a game I have a lot of passion for. And because of that, I got involved with some soccer teams, doing some off-the-field work, dealing with sort of conflict resolution ideas, leadership ideas, and that was specifically with the University of North Carolina women's soccer team and some other teams in North Carolina, and we can talk some more about that later. But hopefully that gives people a little bit of sense of who I am, and certainly very excited about all the World Cup action going on today.
Absolutely, and so we'd love to hear some background about some of the types of problems that you found exist. You might as well go with soccer, given that we are in the middle of the World Cup, and to talk about what are those problems that do show themselves on or off the field, whether it's in terms of wins or other costs.
Sure. The two areas that I think might be of interest to your viewers, one is sort of how different sort of conflict style ideas show up on teams. It's been very much in use, the idea that people might avoid conflict or compromise or compete or dominate. And we worked with the UNC women's team and the Mount Olive women's team around sort of both how this affects them on the field and off the field. For instance, we took the UNC women's team through this sort of conflict styles inventory. They sort of self-identified. One player, I recall very vividly, talked about, I hate conflict. I avoid it at all costs off the field. And I think it even shows up on the field. So what we did with teams was try to help them understand and be aware of different choices. Not that one was necessarily better or worse, but that depended upon the situation they were in, they might make different choices. So that player that always avoided conflict, well, if the relationship was important, that might not be the best choice, or if they're on the field, avoiding that 50-50 ball might not be the right choice. So we worked with players to help sort of identify changes that they could make in sort of what style or approach to conflict. So that was one area that we focused on.
You mentioned there were two areas.
Yes, the other area was really around sort of leadership styles that show up on teams and how that impacts teams sort of on and off the field. We had experiences with players at UNC and other places that sort of led us to this idea of what we called we called it the stepping up leadership model. The idea was that most teams have sort of formal leaders, and at the top, if you will, you have your coaches, your assistant coaches, your official team captains. You have sort of norms and culture that a team might establish. For instance, at UNC, they have a set of core values that the players learn about and discuss and try to implement in their sort of day-to-day work on the field and in school. And then what we found and what we talked about with teams was that what made a good team really great was if everybody would be a leader sort of in their own way and at their own time. And so because we heard things from players like, well, the coach selected the captain, so I don't really have a leadership role anymore. And we felt that team's performance on the field seemed to the level got raised, or the players stepped up when they felt like they could actually be a leader off the field and then translating it onto the field. So those were the two areas that we did some work with the UNC teams, and then I went up to Maine and worked with some high school teams at a team prep camp one summer in those two areas.
And so, tell us a bit more about what you saw as some of the impact. Very interesting. Not a lot of folks, as we've seen and from our institute, have a first inclination to say, "Oh, I want to bring in some of these ADR folks, these conflict management folks, to help us with our team performance." What were some of the impacts that you saw? Certainly, you had a high-profile coach at UNC. What was the reception around the work you did?
Well, it was very well received. The conflict styles. We went back. So we did this work in August, usually each year, and we'd go back in November and ask players, did they use any of this? And so two anecdotal stories that came. One was the players talking about being on a road trip and at a restaurant, and some player getting into something with someone, and all of them, the other co-players said, "Oh, you're just a dominator," and so they all kind of were able to identify the behavior. They laughed about it, diffused the situation, and that was sort of an off the field. I think what I remember most that really struck me was one of the players who was Maggie Tomeka, and I remember her name well because she was a senior central midfielder for UNC. She was a very strong, tall, athletic woman. And we went and talked with them in November, and she happened to actually sought us out. And she said, I did that conflict styles inventory with you, and it suggested to me that I was kind of an accommodating personality. Whatever you want, that's okay. And I thought about that, and I really thought, I don't want to be that way. This is my senior year. I'm in the center of the field. I need to take control. And she at least said, self-discussed and self-advised us that she felt like it made a huge difference. And off the field, watching her play, she had a great year, and that was a year that the UNC team, they went 27-0. They outscored in the NCAA tournament their opponents 32-0, and we claimed a lot of input on that winning season, but at least for Maggie Tomeka, it seemed to make a big difference. So we're delighted that it showed up in that way.
Well, Anson Dorrance is, of course, very famous because he's claimed that coaching men and women is fundamentally different. And you have a unique perspective because you played for him when he was just starting out and coaching both the men and the women, and then you've worked with him coaching women. And so one of the things he said, for example, is that men speak English, women speak code, or women they don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. The flip side is guys are easier to coach because they're jerks. And what he meant by that is, they're going to decide, for example, relationships, focus on, on ball, maybe if they don't like. If you want to give any perspective on how this kind of tests and work you did with them, with women was unique from what you might have expected with men, or did you find that it wasn't that different?
Well, certainly, having played for Anson and worked with some of his teams, and having played the game and worked with other teams, both men and women, boys and girls, I think there certainly are some differences. And I know in our work with sort of women's teams, the idea of relationships seems to be more important. And yet, I really think that is, while maybe not as publicly addressed, is also very important on men's teams. Particularly the game of soccer, you have 11 players on the field. Everybody does need to connect in some ways. I think guys, our skins are a little bit thicker, and we might, our blood might boil. We might get mad at a teammate, and then we can move on a bit more quickly. With women, I think that it's true is probably less so, and I think that's what Anson was speaking to. I have found, though, in the various work I've done, for example, just recently have done some work with the Capital Area Railhawks Development Academy, a fairly new academy program in the Raleigh-Durham area. And right now it's just boys teams, and we worked with them off the field and had them go through some team building exercises, some goal setting around their seasons, and for me as a trainer, the key is getting them to talk and work together. And so with guys, I will say I find putting them in smaller groups seems to work better than asking one question to an entirely open or larger group. I think with women and girls, small groups absolutely work great, and they're sometimes more comfortable in sort of the larger settings as far as to share ideas. So those are just some ideas that I think are different. On the whole, though, I think that that teams, whether they're boys or girls, they still need that attention. Here's an example. We worked with a team up in Maine at a summer team soccer camp, and vividly remember talking to the coach ahead of time. We were setting up the session, and he wanted his sort of key players to talk about leadership on the team. The captain had been selected. The other players, during the course of our discussion, one of the players said something like, well, you're the captain, so that's for you to decide. And the captain looked at his teammates and he said something like, well, guys, I can't do this myself. I need your help. We need to all be, leaders together on this team. And, that was one of those moments that even for guys, the relationship mattered, the connection, the creating a space for them to have a good conversation. I think really made a difference for those folks, and hopefully led them to some great success in the season. So those are some thoughts about gender differences.
And so, Roy, you've been a lifelong athlete. One of the things I'd be curious as to any situations you've had or encountered in your own playing days that had real impact on you, whether it was conflict or something just more more personal. But what were some of the things that you've encountered where you wish you had that kind of background if you could have gone back in time?
Right. So, I played soccer at Carolina when I played. It was quite different from how it is today, and we had, I think we played 11 games my freshman year, and by my senior year we had 22 games, and the level of play had increased a lot. I think that one of the things I really learned my first year, I came in as a freshman and ended up playing quite a bit, took a spot from a senior player, and for me, it really imparted on me, to work hard all the time, don't take anything for granted. And so that was my, I guess, identity through my sports time, was to always work hard. I was one of those guys that, trained 110% because I felt like what you did in practice was what translated into the games. I think that if I had known more about sort of the conflict resolution skills and ideas now, I think we would have done some more off-the-field kind of work with the team. We never met really off the field as a team other than maybe a preseason to select captains. We never really did any goal setting. We didn't really have discussions if some issues came up. I think teams do a lot more with that, and that was one of the data points we got out of the leadership survey data from the National Soccer Coaches Association. Coaches talked about that they did have sort of off-season or out-of-season meetings of the team or with their captains and leadership, and really encouraged the team to have those kinds of interactions. So I think that's something I would have taken back, was to really do some work off the field as well as sort of the hard work on the field.
Some people have suggested that athletes, especially I think male ones, are not open to that open to these kind of sort of what they might see as indirectly related or sort of soft approaches to we should be more in touch with ourselves, more in touch with our teammates, that kind of thing. But you found that that's not true, and I thought it'd be great if you shared with us the example of the marshmallow experiment and that you've had experience with.
Sure. So, in particular, most of my work has been in soccer, and while most games have a strong mental component to it, I find, and I think that's one of the reasons why I have such passion about the game, is it is so challenging mentally with 11 people and then the other team, and everybody needs to be moving. And so I think that suggests a receptive nature by soccer players, for instance, to the sort of thinking parts of the game. I did, though, recently worked with 14 and 15, 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17 and 18 boys teams at the Capital Area Railhawks Academy, and we did this. It's called the Marshmallow Challenge, where we had groups of 4 or 5 guys. They have 26 of spaghetti. They have masking tape and rope, and we get the music cranked up. And the idea is to build the tallest tower you can build, and with the marshmallow at the top. And so we set this up, and all these guys, they got into it. They had a good time. They enjoyed sort of the challenge of it. They competed from one group to the next. The coach set some stakes for them so that the team with the highest tower didn't have to collect cones and balls at the end of practice, so they got to play with something. And we used that as a warm-up to get the groups to understand that we were in a different space than the training field, but this was off-the-field training, and we wanted them to have some fun and also to kind of be open to some new ideas. So found them very receptive to that, and just for instance, I do some other teaching. I've done the Marshmallow Challenge with law students, with graduate students in conflict studies, with undergraduates, and everybody seems to find it. They might look at it a little bit funny to start, but once they get going, people all seem to take on that challenge. So I found guys receptive to that if you really set the stage and have them be thinking about that this mental work off the field is going to translate to what happens on the field. They seem to embrace it.
And Roy, one of the things you talked about briefly when we were talking before we went on air was a role that to me sounded a lot like an ombuds role that you've helped develop with one of the programs. I was hoping maybe you could touch on that and what that role is all about and how maybe it's impacted a bit too.
Right. So the role that a fairly new role and one that's still sort of developing is with this Capital Area Railhawk Soccer Development Academy. We developed what we called the CIC, the Club Interactions Coach. And this was the role did have, the idea was that it would potentially have some sort of ombuds function. If people had disputes or conflicts, they could reach out to me confidentially, and I could talk with them, work with them to determine how they wanted to proceed, whether to talk to their coach directly or an administrator. It could be a player, it could be a parent, it could be another coach. So there was that function that was laid out to all the players, coaches, and parents that were involved. The role that really developed over this year was really just working with the teams on sort of some team building, and part of it was to build my relationship with the players so that if they had issues, they could feel comfortable coming to me. So the meetings were served the dual purpose of, for example, the preseason or early season meetings were, what things do you want to bring to this season? What's worked well for you in the past? What do you want to keep doing? Sort of individual and maybe some team goals, and really, again, to get them comfortable with me as somebody that perhaps they could interact with or I could provide assistance. I will say that role, sort of the ombuds kind of function, didn't really get utilized this year. We'll just look to kind of keep building experiences as we move forward. But that was, again, the Club Interactions Coach is kind of a new idea that we're trying on here.
Can I add on that? I know we've talked a bit about some of the ways we can build structures in place to prevent some of the things that we've seen around, whether it's coach bullying or locker room culture issues. Ken, any thoughts you want to take on this, or Roy as well?
Well, I think what's really encouraging, listening to what you're saying, Roy, is that I had always thought, or maybe it is the case still sometimes, that coaches have a strong sense of what you might call managerial prerogative. That is to say, they don't like losing their prerogative. And the idea that they have a coach who's essentially and the players go to, or an ombuds type figure that the players go to, I thought they would be resistant. But your experience is actually that they see the value in this. That's very encouraging to me.
Right. Again, it's still fairly new and a developing idea, and yet I think particularly the executive director, John Bradford, thought that it would sort of strengthen the program if there were sort of these non-traditional lines of communication that an ombuds role generally plays. Not that they had issues that they were concerned about, and yet thought that, as you mentioned, Ken, that it could potentially sort of strengthen their program. And yes, the coaches do have strong sort of managerial oversight, and that's why, particularly around these trainings and team meetings, I've worked with the coaches to develop themes. Again, most of those meetings, though, were done without the coach present, with the idea that we created a space where the players could have conversations without the coach present, and the coaches were very supportive of that. They wanted players to be able to communicate openly so they could address issues and not necessarily carry them onto the field and have it impact their play.
Yeah, Roy, it's really fun hearing some of these stories of ways you're using ADR in sports. We often joke that there are people in the world who know ADR and there are people in the world who know sports, and very few people who know both. And so it's really fun to have you as a colleague out there doing this. Any final thoughts that you wish to share as we wrap this particular episode up?
The only thing I'll share, and I saw it today, was this idea of conflict styles and how it could impact on the field. For those soccer fans out there that saw Portugal and Germany play today, there was an incident. Pepe, the central defender of Portugal, got in some contact with Thomas Muller. Muller went down. No foul was called. It was Portugal's ball, but Pepe bent down and maybe gave him a little bit of a headbutt and ended up with a red card. And to me, that's an example of you're in a conflict in the game, and he didn't take the right approach to that. It was sort of going to be my way or the highway. I'm going to dominate, compete, and that was the wrong choice there. And those of you who know Pepe know he has a history of some issues around his conduct. He probably could use some off-the-field awareness training around conflict styles, and so maybe he'd stay out of trouble the next time. But I think if you watch games, particularly in the World Cup or even on the recreational level, you'll see kids take themselves out of games, get upset, and part of that is how they react in that moment of conflict. And I think there's a lot of ground and education that we can do in the sports area of these ideas so that everybody can get sort of maximum enjoyment and levels of competition. So I suppose I'll just share that as a final thought.
Okay, well, thank you again for joining us today and sharing some of your innovation and stories of how you put this into play. We look forward to hearing more of these as we move forward, and please consider us a resource as you continue to do so.
Great. Well, Josh and Ken, I appreciate you inviting me to spend time with you, and thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.